On Tuesday morning, in a race to get it through Congress before Trump's self-imposed 4th of July deadline, the US Senate passed its amended version of the One Big Beautiful Bill, the 1,000-page mega bill crammed with essentially all of Trump's campaign pledges. The original version of this bill, which was narrowly passed by the House of Representatives in May, was already pretty controversial, even among Republicans, largely because of its impact on the national debt. However, this new version passed by the Senate looks set to be even more controversial, with a number of provisions that, according to most economists, will further benefit the richest Americans, cut benefits from the poorest, and put even more strain on America's public finances. So in this video, we're going to take a look at this new version of the BBB, why it looks arguably worse, and whether Trump will be able to force it through Congress. We're getting ever closer to 1 million subscribers, and 68% of you aren't even subscribed yet. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's get straight into it. Perhaps the most important difference between this version of the BBB and the last one is that it actually strains America's public finances even further. The original version of the BBB, passed in May, was already pretty expensive. The Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, for instance, estimated that it would add $2.4 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years, and that's excluding increased debt servicing costs. And that's largely thanks to the costs of extending Trump's 2017 tax cuts, which were due to expire over the next couple of years. While pinning down precise figures for the Senate version is difficult because so many amendments have been thrown around and the final version only passed about 24 hours ago, both the Congressional Budget Office and Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget have previously estimated that it would add an additional $800 billion to the national debt over the next 10 years, and that's on top of the $2.4 trillion from the original bill. This will take the US debt to GDP ratio up to 150%, one of the highest in the world. This is largely because the Senate version has pared back certain spending cuts that were spooking Senate Republicans, including to rural hospitals and farming, and because the Senate version includes a couple of further tax cuts, mostly centered around state and local tax or SALT deductions. For context, the SALT deduction allows taxpayers to deduct certain taxes paid to state and local governments from their federal taxable income. The specifics are pretty complicated, but the TLDR is that this generally benefits rich people in high-tax states, like New York or California, and it's currently capped at $10,000 per year per household. But the House version of the BBB wants to raise this to $40,000 for households earning less than $500,000 a year, which would basically benefit those earning between $150,000 and $500,000. But the Senate version goes even further and protects a series of workarounds that allow rich people to avoid the cap altogether, thus avoiding paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal taxes. All in all, the Senate's version of the BBB will cost the bottom 20% of taxpayers an average of $560 a year, but it will give an average boost of $6,055 to those on the top end, according to analysis by Yale's Budget Lab, a cost which will be funded with yet more debt. While the White House will argue that at least some of this new debt should be offset by new tariff revenues, this would still imply that the US is continuing to run deficits of at least 6% of GDP for the foreseeable future. And that's before you even take into account the negative impact that most economists expect tariffs to have on GDP growth. Now, this is both unsustainable and way above the 3% deficit that Scott Bessent promised during the campaign. It's also restarted an ongoing feud between Trump and Elon Musk, who's taken to X to attack the bill's fiscal implications and again threatened to create a new America party or fund primary challenges against Republicans who vote for the bill. Now, to offset some of these costs, the updated BBB also includes more cuts to welfare spending. These are mostly aimed at Medicaid, which provides health coverage to poorer Americans via a combination of stricter eligibility requirements and cuts to the so-called provider tax. Now, to be fair, the provider tax is a bit mad. It's basically a way for state governments and local hospitals to conspire to squeeze more money out of the federal government. In short, the federal government pays for half of all Medicaid costs, so a procedure that costs $100 at a hospital should cost the state government $50 and the federal government $50. However, most states squeeze more money out of the federal government by putting a provider tax on hospitals, then letting them charge inflated fees. For example, if the state imposes a 10% provider tax, the hospital will increase its prices to $110, and then the state government will collect $10. Paying the provider $110 instead of $100 and then collecting the extra $10 in tax may seem pointless. But because the cost of the operation has nominally gone up from $100 to $110, the federal government will now contribute $55 instead of $50, which is beneficial to the state. Now, the new version of the BBB will incrementally reduce the allowable provider tax to 3.5%, down from 6% in the House bill, with the drawdown beginning in 2028. Nonetheless, even if the provider tax is a bit silly, it still effectively implies a steep cut to Medicaid spending, given that provider taxes account for about 10% of all federal Medicaid funding, and as much as 35% in some states like Utah. All in all, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the bill would increase the number of uninsured Americans by nearly 12 million people by 2035. The final difference between the two versions of the BBB worth mentioning concerns energy. That's because the House version of the BBB included the withdrawal of billions of dollars from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, a Biden-era legislation that introduced massive subsidies and tax cuts for domestic investments in renewable energy and nuclear power. Now, this was already causing some consternation among not just climate-conscious progressives, but also Republicans in states experiencing IRA-induced manufacturing booms in clean energy. But the original Senate version of the BBB went one step further, with an excise tax on new renewable projects, but this was stripped out at the last minute. Nonetheless, the latest version still implies a rapid phase-out of IRA subsidies, undermining investor confidence and the climate transition. Conversely, the new bill includes a tax breaks for metallurgical coal, with Trump's energy secretary saying that he imagines coal, natural gas, and nuclear to be the future of America's energy system. Unsurprisingly, numerous polls have found that the BBB is deeply unpopular and fares terribly with independents. A Fox News poll from last month, for instance, found that just 22% of independents support the BBB, while 73% oppose it. Nonetheless, even if it's unpopular with the wider public, the threat of a Trump-backed primary challenger will probably force Republicans into line. All of this plays into a broader feeling coming out of America at the moment. At one time, the US seemed to be a steady, stabilizing force in global politics. But it seems that those days are over, with American influence, popularity, and dominance on the decline. So in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, we're discussing this shift and the potential that we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section of the magazine, we unpack everything from the collapse of democratic norms in the US to the decline of American soft power, and if the US can maintain its dominance in energy and technology. We also discuss the people who could pick up the reins from the US, like if China, Europe, or even a new multipolar order could replace America. This magazine is our longest ever, coming in at 76 pages, and it's full of our very best journalism and well thought through analysis. That goes beyond just the US too, with more than half of the magazine dedicated to other topics, from Germany's new focus on military might, the offshoring of migrants around the world, how Nigel Farage could become Britain's next Prime Minister, or our section where we ask a handful of experts what's really driving anti-establishment sentiment around the world. You can pre-order a copy of Too Long from our website right now, or you can subscribe to make sure that you never miss an issue going forward. And if you do, you'll also get 20% off every copy as long as you're subscribed. Plus, just this week, if you use code AmericanOrder, you'll get an additional 20% off any subscription, bringing down the price to as little as £6.40. So pre-order a copy now to get yourself all of that extra content and support the journalism that we do here at TLDR every single day.